Chapter 11 Manifesting in Nothingness. If science can prove atoms and energy, then where does imagination and beauty come from? The Cosmic Game.
I would like to discuss how our current reality is created. Recognize we have been making comments that Maya is nothingness, which is capable of manifesting some type of reality. This is confusing, and hopefully the concept of having a dream in which it is real to the dreamer but not to anyone else is a helpful analogy. Here we are trying to explain something that is beyond the restrictions of our current available language, belief systems, and general comprehension. In modern science, we hold the concept that what we cannot prove does not exist. This makes it difficult for us to conceptualize the process of reality. Nevertheless, let us try. Imagine that you are looking through a window into a sealed room. You have the capability to change the temperature in the room to very extreme degrees. The room is strong enough to withstand any reaction that can take place within it. In the room, you have huge blocks of ice. You then begin to increase the temperature. At a certain time, the ice melts. The room is now filled with water. You continue to turn the heat up. The room is now filled with blistering steam. You heat the room up even more intensely. The steam is so powerfully agitated that the atoms become accelerated, and suddenly the state changes to one that is now invisible to our naked eyes. You call someone to observe the room with you. You ask them to describe what is contained in the room. They tell you that it is empty. You say, "Watch this," and then begin to cool the room. Suddenly, steam appears. They marvel at what you have done. You tell them to keep watching as you cool the room even more. Suddenly, there is water, then ice. A child would marvel at the magic that you created. Science has come a long way and advanced our knowledge and lives in many ways. As we transition into new states of matter and energy, science is like a child in wonderment. We kept the room strong enough to contain any energy within it. Each state has a certain amount of energy power. We know that a large volume of water can play a role in creating hydroelectric energy. Steam can work engines. Highly accelerated particles can have the potential to create explosive energy. Each state has different potentials within it. Einstein states matter is frozen light. Now think of the light that Einstein is talking about. Think of it as a very intense type of light that we cannot see. As we slow that light down, there are different layers, or perhaps we can use the term spectrum of that light. Eventually, it is slowed to the current described speed of light. As this light frequency is slowed down further, it begins to be manifest as atoms, molecules, and visible objects. Currently, modern science has capable technology to study mass and some types of energy. We can study the biochemistry and physiology of organ systems in medicine. In the area of quantum physics, we are discovering that beyond atoms, there are other types of light. If we were to follow Einstein in reverse, we will be discovering in the future that beyond those light particles, there are other subtle layers of light or energy particles that move much faster than the speed of light. These layers have intensity and consciousness at every level. The closer to the source from which this light originates, the greater the power, energy, as well as consciousness exists. It is like trying to create a perfume. We start with a large dilution of liquid and the aromas or oils that create the perfume. As we synthesize it, we create eau de cologne, and then gradually, as we refine and concentrate it, we achieve the very pure essence of the perfume. Imagine sitting in a room and we see all the furniture, light fixtures, walls, and everything that makes up that room. Now we already know that if we were to look at it from the theory of modern science, the majority of the room is space and there are atoms floating around in it. The volume of space is much larger compared to that of the atoms. Let us start with emptying the room completely of everything. We remove the contents, including the atoms from which they are formed. It is difficult for our mind to imagine absolute nothingness. Let us try to imagine this state. It is said that if we take a 6-story concrete building, the average size of a North American block, and remove all the space between the atoms, we would end up with just enough atoms to fill a pack of cigarettes. Think about this. How can atoms that fill a pack of cigarettes manifest as a huge 6-story building? Include the fact that it is fully furnished. We can touch walls, sit on furniture, and enjoy television. How can this be an illusion? So let us go back to Maya and nothingness. We are sitting in this room where even the chair we rest on does not exist. We are emptying the room of any object or mass that we can perceive. We are now down to atoms that are floating around the room. They adopt certain configurations with a large amount of space in between them. It is like being near a busy airport on a dark night and we are seeing the flashing lights of a number of airplanes that are coming in for landing or have taken off. These airplanes appear to be random in the dark, but they seem to be moving in a well-organized way. When we go to movies, we are beginning to experience improvements in the technology so that we now have three-dimensional films or 3D. These are more realistic than the movies that we normally see on the screen. They appear almost lifelike, and sometimes we actually startle when it seems that something is coming towards us from on the screen. Now let us create a more sophisticated movie system than 3D. In it, the light actually begins to manifest shapes that we not only see it on the screen, but it appears to fill out in the space between the viewer and the screen. It will be so lifelike that we can in fact feel as if we are literally part of that movie. The movie actually surrounds us. However, what we are looking at appears so real, is a compilation of various colors and light particles at different wavelengths to create seeming objects and activity. This is closer to how our reality is. We are a conglomeration of interactive light movements and speeds that produce our reality. Now back to the concept of our own reality. We are sitting in this room and science tells us that there are very few atoms hovering in the space around us. These atoms are so minute that we cannot see or examine them with the visible eye, but only with very sophisticated technology. So imagine in this space that we are observing, these little atoms light up like very tiny pinpricks of light, which are floating around gently so we can observe the difference between the atoms and the space around each. It is like the analogy of the airplane lights and the darkness around them, or looking at the stars at night. We focus on the stars but pay very little attention to the vast space between them. If we follow Einstein, those tiny pinpricks of light that are floating around in the space are really aspects of light that have been frozen to a certain speed. However, we need to realize that in the space between the atoms, there are numerous layers of energy that have consciousness. I use the term energy because it is very difficult to find a word in our vocabulary that will describe these layers of consciousness. If we are sitting there and watching this tiny pinprick of atoms lighting that space and then suddenly switch on the room, the furniture and everything appears again. Some magic has taken place. The nothingness between the atoms is interacting with those atoms to create the appearance of objects, pictures, sounds, smells, etc. This is the magical process that manifests as the interaction between all of these layers, which produces levels of reality that we can perceive. I often like to think of atoms as tethers that hold a spider's web open and show the beauty that the web manifests. I think of the atoms as points along that web that are like clothespins to hold things in place. Then suddenly, the whole spider's web lights up to show all its colors and complex layers and fragility. This is a phenomenon that is still not fully understood. The atoms are like tethers or clothespins that exist in the space. The magic takes place as different layers of consciousness or energy begin to respond in specific ways to create a dynamic, vibrant picture for us. That is what we accept as reality. Let us challenge some of what we are talking about. We talk about dynamic interaction and magic takes place from it. If we were to take the atom by itself, modern science tells us that an atom is a small core of neutrons and protons which act like a nucleus. Floating around this nucleus of neutrons and protons are electrons. There is again huge space even between the electrons and the nucleus of the atom. We have learned in science that these electrons move in a specific way or orbital around the nucleus, like the moon moves around the Earth. This gives us measurements because we use space and time and direction to figure out how electrons move around the nucleus. However, in quantum physics, there is phenomenon that is appearing with even the simple issue of electrons orbiting the nucleus that modern science has no answer for. For example, we are discovering that the electrons, its speeds, and its orbital are actually very unpredictable. An electron would be observed moving in a specific direction at a measured speed. This would tell us that if we know where it is heading and the speed at which it is moving, we can anticipate where it would be at a certain time. What we are discovering now is that the electron may be moving in a certain direction and speed when unexpectedly it appears somewhere else in its orbit around the nucleus. Calculating its direction and speed, the electron could not possibly turn up in that new location. They appear to be moving faster than the speed of light. Moreover, even a single atom has some dynamic process going on with it and the space between the electrons, protons, and neutrons of the atom. In the future, we will learn that there is a certain consciousness that creates this change in the particles. As they shift, they begin to change reality. When we look at a person directly as we are speaking to them and then turn and focus on another person, science will also show in the future that the atoms in the room actually rearrange themselves immediately to provide a different type of configuration so that we can see another aspect of reality manifested instantaneously. For the second person to become apparent, our whole reality undergoes spontaneous shifts and rearrangements. When we look at the stars, the void or space is uninterrupted. If we sit opposite to each other, the space between our atoms is continuous with each other and the rest of the room. It is connected with that of the walls and the whole universe. In quantum physics, we are at present discovering that there is energy in that space. It has properties that are now being demonstrated to have unique capabilities. An interesting phenomenon is that the energy becomes mass when we are observing it. When it is not observed, it remains as light. This mass is described as small particles called photons. I thoroughly enjoyed reading The Divine Matrix and have recommended it to many of my friends. In it, author Greg Braden described observations and research done on photons by Professor Nicholas Gizin and his team at the University of Geneva. If one photon was taken and split into two, these were then called twin photons as they came from the same source. Experiments have shown that in a specially designed chamber, each of the twin photons was fired in opposite directions along two fiber optic paths 7 miles in length, thus 14 miles ultimately apart from each other. The photons were then offered two random routes at the end of that path. Each twin photon at the speed of light would consistently make the same decision. It did not mean that they were choosing only one of the two routes. No, what was discovered was that whatever the choice one made, the other spontaneously made that same choice. It was instantaneous at the speed of light, and it appeared that time and space had no effect on them. We are capable of observing this, but we do not have an idea how this works at this time. There seems to be some understanding and communication taking place in this process. Greg Braden goes on to describe further experiments carried out by Poponin and Gariev. What they did was created a vacuum in a special container. On observation in this vacuum, photons moved in a random scattered way within the container. When samples of human DNA were placed in the vacuum under careful scientific conditions, the photons immediately rearranged themselves. They kept a very specific, ordered configuration. The expectation was that if the DNA was removed, that the photons would then go back to their random scattered state. The big surprise was that even though the DNA was removed, the photons still kept their precise arrangement rather than return to their ordinary arbitrary state. This is important to note because the photon energy that kept the precise pattern for a specific DNA represents a similar analogy to a fingerprint for identification. We leave our fingerprints in the cosmos. These fingerprints remain constant in time. They contain subtle information systems which draw us back to them. They contain memory and experiences that provide the laboratory for us to work through our agendas. They act like glue. It keeps us connected to Maya. By weakening them, we become less attached to Maya. Braden describes further experiments by Dr. Cleve Baxter reported in the journal Advances in 1993. The Army performed certain experiments. DNA from a subject was placed in a specially designed chamber and measured electrically. The donor of the DNA was in another room several hundred feet away. When the subject was shown a series of images to trigger different emotions, instantaneously his DNA triggered powerful electrical impulses. Dr. Baxter expanded the experiment at one time to a span of 350 miles between donor and his DNA. The response was gauged by an atomic clock. The time difference between the emotions of the person and cell's response was 0. The effect was simultaneous. Our universe is operating at so many different subtle levels, and already at some levels it is being shown that emotions, DNA, special fingerprinting appears to be taking place spontaneously in an interactive way for us. If we summarize the concept of intention, There is compelling evidence to show that wavelengths of light only manifest as particles when we observe them. As soon as we look away from them and pay no attention, it reverts back to its original light form. There is an association from this that is very important to understand. When saints and highly evolved masters are asked, "How large is our universe?" they routinely answer that our universe is really small. So as I write this, I suddenly look through my window at the mountains. As I am paying attention to that view, the mountains manifest. Therefore, it stands to reason that when I am not paying attention to other areas around me, that they change back from mass to light. It is important to note that our universe at any time is what we are paying attention to at that particular moment. Everything else ceases to exist. Our universe is actually manifesting only in the area that we are focusing on. If you are not thinking about your car in the garage or your garden outside, then that reverts to light and is no longer mass. So when I hear the question, if a tree falls in the woods, does it make a sound? I smile because if no one is observing it, the tree or the woods do not exist. So what is being suggested here? Who do you think creates the reality that exists in your perception? If you guess right, you are controlling the world that is being created around you. We will continue to expand on this process.
Who walks with me? Do you? There is only one true path. It leads to the divine. If you walk that path, you walk with me. The Cosmic Game.